Greetings, I'm Eric, and this is the Commander's Beacon. And we're here to talk about some unconventional ways that you might build your commander deck, kind of like eating your pizza with a fork. That's how I eat my pizza. Don't judge. So today we're going to go over part 2 of our Commander Legends review. So last time we talked about the partners. This time we're going to talk about some of the other legendary creatures and mechanics. We'll talk about Monarch, we'll talk about Encore, we'll even talk about Boros dwarves and a Jeskai Chimera. First, let's talk about Encore. This is a new mechanic in Commander Legends. I believe there are 16 creatures that feature this mechanic. Let's go over an example. Amphin Mutineer is a 3/3 Salamander Pirate that costs 3 and a blue. When Amphin Mutineer enters the battlefield, you exile up to one target non-Salamander creature. That creature's controller creates a 4/3 blue Salamander Warrior creature token. And it has Encore. You can pay 4 and 2 blue and exile this card from your graveyard, and for each opponent you create a token copy that attacks that opponent this turn if able. Those tokens gain haste, and you sacrifice them at the beginning of the next end step. You can activate Encore only as a sorcery. So in your normal 4-player game of Commander, assuming each of your opponents is still alive, when you use a creature's Encore ability, you'll get 3 token copies of it. Now, you'll notice these tokens aren't exiled at the end of the turn, they're sacrificed, so you'll also get any whenever a creature dies triggers. But when we talk about Encore, we really need to mention Arami. This is a new legendary creature from Commander Legends, so it can be your commander. Arami is a 1/4 Merfolk wizard that costs 1 blue-black, and if you tap it and exile cards from your graveyard equal to the number of opponents you have, then target creature card in your graveyard gains Encore until end of turn. The Encore cost is equal to its mana cost. So Arami can give anything Encore. You can do silly things with Agent of Treachery, for example, like steal 3 things, 1 from each opponent, and then, you draw 9 cards at the end of your turn because, guess what, you control at least 3 things that you don't own, and 3 copies of Agent of Treachery. So why would we want to build around the small number of creatures that already have Encore when there's a perfectly good Encore commander already in Arami? Well, maybe we want to play in colors other than Dimir, but more importantly perhaps, I want to focus on abusing the Encore mechanic rather than just enabling it. So how do we abuse Encore? Well, we're going to want to get repeated Encore creature triggers to let us win the game. But Encore exiles the creature, so how do we do this? Well, we need Rift Sweeper. This is a 2/2 elf shaman that costs 1 and a green, and it has when Rift Sweeper enters the battlefield, choose target face-up exiled card, its owner shuffles it into their library. Now, you know that whenever you see a Rift Sweeper in a deck list, some shenanigans are afoot. And indeed, they are here as well. But just be forewarned, we're going to need to go through a multi-step process to make this strategy work. First, we need to get an Encore creature into our graveyard. Then, we need to exile that creature to its Encore mechanic. Then, we need to find a Rift Sweeper and cast it to put the exiled creature back into our library. Next, we need to get that Encore creature back out of our library and into the graveyard again, so we can Encore it again. Then we need to bounce, blink, or sacrifice and recur Rift Sweeper to recover and Encore that creature again, and repeat. And once we do all of these things, what Encore creatures are we getting to abuse? Who can command this deck? Well, first of all, what colors do we want? Again, there's only 16 creatures that have Encore by default in Commander Legends. White has 3 such creatures, but only 1 is reasonably okay in an Encore-focused deck. That's Soul of Eternity, which has power and toughness equal to your life total. It costs 7 mana, Encores for 9 mana, and has no evasion. It's okay. I'd include it if I'm playing white, but I won't be excited about it. Blue has 3 Encore creatures, and they all provide good utility, but none of them win games. Amphin Mutineer, we already talked about this one. It exiles a creature when it enters the battlefield. Kitesail's Skirmisher is a 3/1 with flying that gives another attacking creature flying, as long as it's attacking the same player or planeswalker. Not so great. Trove Tracker is a 2/2 that draws you a card when it dies, and its Encore cost is kind of expensive at 7 mana. Now, black has 4 Encore creatures. Rakshasa Debaser is probably the most noteworthy one here. It's a 6/6 cat demon. But aren't all cats demons, though? Anyways, this one costs 4 and 2 black, and when it attacks, you put target creature card from defending player's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. And it can Encore for 8 mana. So it's kind of like Sepulchral Primordial. If you didn't know, Sepulchral Primordial is pretty good in Commander. Then there's Briarblade Adept. This is a 3/4 Elf Assassin, and when it attacks, it gives an opponent's creature -1/-1 until end of turn. You might play it, but again, you won't be excited about it. Elvish Dreadlord is a 3/3 zombie elf with Death Touch, and in fact it is one of only 7 zombie elves in all of Magic. No, I'm not counting changelings. Anyways, when this guy dies, all non-elf creatures get -3/-3 until end of turn, so when you Encore it, it's basically a board wipe for 7 mana. Red has 3 Encore creatures, but these guys can actually win games. So this is where I might focus if I'm building around the mechanic. First up is Coastline Marauders. This is a 3/3 human pirate with trample. It has, whenever it attacks, it gets +1/+0 until end of turn for each land defending player controls. Take that, green ramp. Late game, this guy could be hitting for 12 or 15 or more. And it has an Encore cost of 4 and 2 red. Fathom Fleet Swordjack is a 4/3 orc pirate that, when it attacks, it deals damage to the player or planeswalker it's attacking, equal to the number of artifacts you control. Now, you'll need to build around artifacts to make this worthwhile, but if you do, this will win you games. And he doesn't even need to deal damage to trigger this effect, he just attacks. And he Encores for 5 and a red. And then there's Impulsive Pilferer. This is a 1/1 Goblin Pirate for 1 red. When it dies, you make a treasure, and it Encores for 3 and a red. Now, green only has 1 Encore creature, and it's moderately mediocre. Finclade Fugitives is a 7/4 Elf Salamander Rogue. That's pretty cool. It can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less, and it can Encore for 4 and a green. And then, of course, in colorless, there's Phyrexian Triniform. This is a 9/9 golem that costs 9, and when it dies, it makes 3/3 golem artifact creature tokens. And then, for the very reasonable price of your left kidney, or 12 mana, you can Encore it. But when you do, you'll get 9 more artifact golem creature tokens. So Encore has a lot of utility in blue and black, but if we want to win, we're going to need red most likely. But who is going to lead this deck? First, let's talk about the original. This is Aiden Oakenshield. It's a 1/2 human knight in Jund colors. It has pay Jund and tap it to return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Aiden is here for one thing and one thing only. He can recover Riftsweeper from your graveyard to recast it repeatedly. But we still need to find Riftsweeper out of our deck first. Now, fortunately, green is good at tutoring for creatures, and, well, so is black. But even better, we can also use black cards that find cards and dump them into the graveyard. For example, Entomb, and this will also help us with Encore creatures as well. For 1 black mana and instant speed, Entomb lets us search our library for any card and put it into our graveyard. And between green and black, we might be able to repeatedly pull Encore creatures back out of our library once Riftsweeper recovers them. Fiend Artisan is a 1/1 nightmare that costs 2 Golgari. It gets +1/+1 for each creature card in your graveyard. You can also pay X and a Golgari, tap it, and sacrifice another creature to search your library for a creature card with converted mana cost X or less, and put it onto the battlefield. You can activate this ability only when you could cast sorcery. So you Encore a creature, it goes into exile. You then cast a Riftsweeper to recover that exiled Encore creature back into your library. Then you activate Fiend Artisan, sacrificing the Riftsweeper to pull that Encore creature back out of your library and put it into play. Now you can use any sack outlet to sacrifice that Encore creature, and then it's back in your graveyard. Aiden Oakenshield can recover the Rift Sweeper to start the cycle all over again. Now, with all the sacrificing, could we use Corvold as the commander instead? Now, if you haven't had the privilege of sitting across the table from this guy, you might not know that Corvold is a 4/4 Dragon Noble Nightmare that... wait, no, he's not a nightmare. But he should be. He gives me nightmares. Corvold has flying, and whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you sacrifice another permanent. And when you sacrifice a permanent, he gets a +1/+1 counter, and you draw a card. So Corvold gets 3 sacrifice triggers every time you encore a creature, plus more whenever you sacrifice and recur the Rift Sweeper. But he doesn't help find or recover Rift Sweeper, and Corvold is already good without Encore, and he has far better available strategies. So I probably wouldn't play him here, but you could consider it. Well, what about Kenrith? This guy basically functions just like Aiden Oakenshield, well, except he gives you all 5 colors, he has more abilities, and he's significantly more handsome. Anyways, Kenrith, the Returned King, is a 5/5 human noble that costs 4 and white. He has activated abilities in each color, but the one we care about most here is that you can pay 4 and a black to return a creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield under its owner's control. So Kenrith can easily recur Rift Sweeper for the same price as Aiden Oakenshield, for 5 mana that is, to put it onto the battlefield, but he doesn't need to tap. Aiden only needs 3 mana to recover the card, but that brings it to your hand, so you still need to pay the 2 mana to cast Rift Sweeper, so it's still 5 mana in total. But just like with Aiden Oakenshield, we still need to find Rift Sweeper in our deck before we can get the strategy going. And again, the sequence we'll need to follow to repeatedly abuse Encore effects is possible, but fairly lengthy. So I'd like to propose one last strategy. Let's consider running Vadrok as our commander. Vadrok Apex of Thunder is a 3/3 elemental dinosaur cat that costs red, blue, white, and has flying and first strike. It also has Mutate for 4 mana, 1 Azorius and 2 red, and when it mutates, you may cast target non-creature card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. First, we're not in green, so we can't play Rift Sweeper. And even if we were, Vadrok can't cast creature spells when it mutates, so it can't recover Rift Sweeper from the graveyard. And, well, that's because we're using Pull from Eternity instead. Pull from Eternity is an instant for 1 white that lets you put an exiled card that's face up into its owner's graveyard. Now, Pull from Eternity fits excellently here because we want the Encore card back in the graveyard. Rift Sweeper puts it in the library, but Pull from Eternity puts it in the graveyard. We'll need Self-Mill to put both Encore cards and other Vadrok targets into the graveyard, but fortunately blue has no shortage of these. We may also want some Bounce for Vadrok for repeated mutate triggers, and fortunately blue can help us out here as well. Now note that Vadrok's mutate trigger can cast any non-creature spell with CMC 3 or less from our graveyard, so we probably want mostly low CMC spells in this deck of any non-creature type. And if we are planning on using Fathomfleet Swordjack as a possible win condition, a good number of those non-creature permanents should perhaps be artifacts. Maybe artifacts that we can sacrifice for value to recast with Vadrok's mutate trigger. Artifacts like Dispeller's Capsule, which can destroy artifacts or enchantments. The Lockets are bad mana rocks, but we can cash them in to draw cards later, and then Vadrok can recast them. Now, if we don't care about the ramp, Implement of Examination can also draw cards at a lower mana investment, and again, it can be recurred by Vadrok later. Oblivion Stone is an artifact-based board wipe that costs 3 mana, so Vadrok can recur it. You can look around for your favorite recurable artifacts with CMC 3 or less. There's a bunch of them to choose from. But let's get back to Encore. We are going to want enough creatures in our deck for Vadrok to have a target to mutate onto. And just like with Rift Sweeper, we will need to find Pull from Eternity to get our plan going. We do have options though, again, thanks to blue. Mystical Tutor and Spellseeker can each find an instant for us. And what about Wild Research? This is an enchantment that costs 2 and a red. Then we can pay 1 and a blue to search our library for an instant card and put it into our hand, and then we discard a card at random. We can also do the same for an enchantment if we pay 1 and a white. And we don't actually care if we accidentally discard what we just found, because we can still cast it from the graveyard with Vadrok. Finally, we'll probably want a few other mutate creatures to help trigger Vadrok as well. Lord, Rakdos, Souvenir Snatcher, Dreamtail Heron are some examples. So whenever we mutate one of these onto Vadrok, we'll trigger Vadrok's mutate ability again. Okay, so that's Encore in Commander Legends. I don't typically build jank, but I will openly admit, this is jank. But if you wanted to play around with Encore and you just don't like Orami or you want to be different, this is a pretty unconventional way to do it. Alright, so let's talk about Yuri. Yuri? Yeah, Yuri, we'll go with that. The J is silent. So Yuri, Master of the Review, is a 1/1 human shaman that costs red-black, and he has, whenever you sacrifice a permanent, you put a +1/+1 counter on Yuri. And whenever Yuri dies, he deals damage equal to his power to any target. So probably 95% of all Rakdos decks like to make creature tokens and then sacrifice them for value, but we're going to be different. We're instead going to make artifact tokens, and then sacrifice them for value. So our goal here is to make lots of artifact tokens, like treasures, and then sacrifice them to make Yuri really big, really fast, and then of course sacrifice Yuri to blow someone up. And Yuri's mana cost is so low that we can do this maybe 3 times or so before he gets prohibitively expensive to recast. And well, guess what? We have 3 opponents. Perfect. But first, what are the advantages of using this artifact sacrifice route instead of the normal creature sacrifice route? Well, Rakdos does have its own set of artifact-based aristocrats cards. Disciple of the Vault is a 1/1 human cleric that costs 1 black, and it has, whenever an artifact is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may have target opponent lose 1 life. Marionette Master, this is a 1/3 human artificer that costs 4 and 2 black. It has Fabricate 3. That means when this creature enters the battlefield, you either put 3 +1/+1 counters on it, or you create 3 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature tokens. And then whenever an artifact you control is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, target opponent loses life equal to Marionette Master's power. And then Reckless Fireweaver, this is a 1/3 human artificer that costs 1 and a red, and it has, whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, Reckless Fireweaver deals 1 damage to each opponent. There's also artifact-based win conditions in Rakdos colors. Hellkite Tyrant is a 6/5 dragon that costs 4 and 2 red. It has Flying and Trample, and whenever Hellkite Tyrant deals combat damage to a player, you gain control of all artifacts that player controls. But more importantly, at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 20 or more artifacts, you win the game. And of course, Revel in Riches. This is a enchantment that costs 4 and a black, and it has, whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, you create a treasure token. And at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 10 or more treasures, you win the game. We also get better access to mana ramp if we're focusing on treasure tokens. There are 22 cards in Rakdos colors that produce treasures. Let's discuss a couple of examples here. Ruthless Knave is a 3/2 orc pirate that costs 2 and a black. It lets you pay 2 and a black and sacrifice a creature to create 2 treasure tokens. You can also sacrifice 3 treasures to draw a card. Now, Ruthless Knave is cool here because each activation of his ability gives you 3 sacrifice triggers to pump up Yuri. 1 for the creature that you sacrifice, and then 2 more when you sacrifice the 2 treasures that he makes. And then, of course, Pitiless Plunderer. This is our 1/4 human pirate that costs 3 and a black. It has, whenever another creature you control dies, you create a treasure token. Pitiless Plunderer goes in any aristocrat's deck, including this one. There's Gadrak the Crown Scourge. This is a 5/4 dragon that costs 2 and a red. It has Flying, and it can't attack unless you control 4 or more artifacts. And at the beginning of your end step, you create a treasure token for each non-token creature that died this turn. Now, I'm a bit conflicted on this one. Gadrak only creates treasures when a non-token creature dies, but most of our creatures will be tokens. He also only creates treasures when a creature dies during our turn, so even if we want to kill our opponent's creatures for treasures, we'll need to do it during our turn. But he'll probably make a few treasures for you during the game, and maybe that's good enough. So we talked about treasure tokens. What about clue tokens? Tamiyo's Journal is a 5-mana artifact that produces a clue for you at the beginning of each of your upkeeps. Clues are artifact tokens that you can sacrifice by paying 2 mana and tapping them, and then you get to draw a card. But Tamiyo's Journal is a bad card. Don't play this. Well, what about food tokens? Food tokens are like clues. They're artifact tokens that can be sacrificed by paying 2 mana and tapping them, but instead of drawing a card, you get to gain 3 life. Witch's Oven can sacrifice a creature to make a food token, and if that creature had 4 or more toughness, you'll make 2 food tokens instead. Now, we'll need sacrifice outlets in this deck, first because it's Rakdos, and all Rakdos decks like to sacrifice things, and secondly because Yuri, again because he's Rakdos, needs to be sacrificed occasionally when we want him to die and blow someone up. So Witch's Oven serves the dual purpose here of being both a sack outlet for Yuri and for creating more permanents that can be sacrificed to grow Yuri. But there's plenty of other artifact token makers in these colors. Daretti Ingenious Iconoclast is a planeswalker that costs 1 a black and a red, and he enters with 3 loyalty. His +1 creates an artifact creature token. His -1 allows you to sacrifice an artifact. Great! And then you destroy target artifact or creature. And his -6 lets you choose an artifact card in a graveyard or on the battlefield, and then you create 3 token copies of it. There's Hangerback Walker, the artifact creature that costs 2x, and it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it, and when it dies, you create a 1/1 Thopter artifact creature token for each +1/+1 counter on Hangerback Walker. There's Loyal Apprentice, a 2/1 human artificer that costs 1 and a red. It has haste, and at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you control your commander, you create a 1/1 Thopter artifact creature token with haste. But these are just a few examples. There are dozens and dozens of cards that make artifact tokens in these colors. Just pick your favorites. But we've gone through all this trouble of building a sacrifice deck with artifacts around Yuri, and you might ask, why not just play Korvold? Yeah, you like that question, don't you? And you know what? It's a good question. Let's say, hypothetically, you sacrifice 20 permanents. Yuri is now a 21 damage bomb sitting on the battlefield waiting to blow someone up. And Korvold can't do that. I mean, Korvold will be big, but he still has to get through for combat damage, or you'll need a specific sacrifice outlet like Fling to do the damage. But then again, if you were playing Korvold, you'd have drawn 20 cards. And if you drew 20 cards, you've probably found much more value than just being able to sacrifice Yuri to maybe kill one player. So, yeah, Korvold's better than Yuri, but Korvold's broken. So if you don't want to play a broken sacrifice deck, play Yuri instead. Alright, it's time to talk about Boros. It's time to talk about equipment. It is time to talk about dwarves. It's time to talk about Rayav, Master Smith. Rayav is a 2/2 dwarf artificer that costs red-white, and it has whenever an enchanted or equipped creature you control attacks, that creature gains double strike until end of turn. Now, let's be fair, this deck will not be super innovative. For the most part, it will do normal Boros things, but I think there's some space here to try something a bit unique. Let's use creatures that do something when they deal combat damage to a player. And with Double Strike, they get to do that thing twice. First, this strategy is kind of interesting because it kind of splits your opponent's focus. Do they want to kill your commander or the guy that's actually hitting you and getting some combat damage trigger? And a bit off topic, but we can also use this Double Strike Matters strategy in a Shu Yun or in a Rafik deck. So how does Rayav compare to these? Well, Shu Yun adds blue, but it requires constant casting of spells and paying of mana for the Double Strike. Rafik gives out Double Strike for free, but only to one creature each combat. Rafik is pretty strong, though. So Rayav is probably one of the easiest of these commanders to turn on Double Strike for your other creatures. It is, however, limited to just white and red, so you can't hit people twice with Medomai the Ageless, for example, and take 2 extra turns. We also won't have the card draw or the mana ramp that blue or green offers, so we'll probably need to be more aggressive to keep up with everyone else. So with all that said, what do we use in a Rayav deck? Well, a Blinding Angel, for example, when it deals combat damage to a player, they skip their next combat step. So if it's equipped and it gets Double Strike from Rayav, then they'll skip their next 2 combat steps. Mordant Dragon deals damage to target creature defending player controls when it deals combat damage to that player, and Baleful Dragon does that much to each creature defending player controls. Rapacious One has Trample, so it can punch through combat damage more readily, and then it makes a 0/1 Eldrazi spawn creature token for each combat damage dealt to that player. These spawn tokens can be sacrificed to generate 1 mana. Relic Robber is kind of silly, but it might be fun. When it deals combat damage to an opponent, that player creates a 0/1 colorless goblin construct artifact creature token that deals 1 damage to that player during their upkeep, and the token can't block. And there's Blade Griff Prototype. This is a very collaborative removal. When it deals combat damage to a player, you get to destroy a target non-land permanent of that player's choice that one of your opponents controls. So again, with Double Strike, it kills 2 things of that other player's choice. We can also focus on evasive equipment to help our creatures get through to trigger their effects when they deal combat damage to a player. Sanctuary Blade gives the equipped creature protection from a single color, which helps avoid blockers and some targeted removal. The Whisper Silk Cloak generally works better, it gives them Unblockable and Shroud. And we can also consider anything that gives Trample, since that'll make it more likely that you'll get to do combat damage. See equipment like Shadow Spear, Oinaginata, and Forebear's Blade. But we don't need to stop there. There's a few other equipments that like it when your creatures have Double Strike. Bloodforged Battle Axe gives the equipped creature +2/+0, and whenever the creature deals combat damage to a player, you make a token that's a copy of Bloodforged Battle Axe. So whenever one of your equipped guys hits a player while wielding this, if you've got Rav on the battlefield, you're adding 4 to your total combat damage, and you're making 2 copies of the Battle Axe. With Quiet as Spike, when the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, that player loses half their life, so if you have Double Strike, they're losing about 75% of their life. Prying Blade is a cheap, fair, and budget-friendly card. When the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you get a treasure, or 2 treasures if you have Double Strike. Oh, and any of the swords, they're good in most equipment decks, and they're still good here too. But we are playing Boros, so how do we draw cards? Well, this deck won't be reactive, so impulsive card draw may be fine, because whatever we draw will probably be just fine casting it right now. And so we can lean into the Double Strike Matters theme here too. Stromkirk Occultist is a 3/2 vampire horror that has Trample. It costs 2 and a red, and it has, when it deals combat damage to a player, you may exile the top card of your library, and you may play that card this turn. Dream Pillager does the same, except you exile cards from the top of your library equal to the amount of damage dealt. It's a 4/4 dragon that costs 5 and 2 red. So if its power isn't buffed in any way, this guy will exile the top 8 cards of your library when it deals combat damage to a player, if it has Double Strike. Now, you're probably not going to have the mana to be able to cast all 8 of those cards, and note that the text on this card says you may cast non-land cards exiled this way, so this won't help you make your land drops. But it's still a lot of card advantage. Then there's Subira Tulzidi Caravaner. This is a 2/3 human shaman that really looks more like a rogue. I think this should be a rogue. It costs 2 and a red, and it has haste. You can pay 1 to make another creature with power 2 or less unblockable this turn. You can also pay 1 and a red and tap it and discard your hand, and then until the end of turn, whenever a creature you control with power 2 or less deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card. But of course, if that creature has Double Strike, you draw 2 cards. So this is a really good card advantage in this deck, and it also helps you get in for combat damage. Of course, you can also use card draw equipments. With Rogue's Gloves, whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you draw a card, or again, 2 if it has Double Strike. Mask of Memory is similar. When the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you draw 2 cards and discard a card. Or again, with Double Strike, you essentially draw 4 and discard 2. So this isn't a revolutionary deck by any means. It doesn't push the boundaries of Boros. You're still playing equipment and turning your guys sideways. But doubling up on your combat damage triggers can help push out a lot more value instead of just more damage. And again, I really like that you're making your opponent decide if they want to remove Blinding Angel, who's preventing someone from attacking, or just remove Rayav, who's buffing the angel. Alright, it's time to talk about the Monarch mechanic. So Monarch is a mechanic that only exists in a game once a card adds it to the game. And only one player can be the Monarch at a time. Whoever has the Monarch gets to draw an additional card at the beginning of their end step. And if someone attacks the Monarch and does combat damage to them, they'll steal ownership of the Monarch. Now, Monarch is not new with Commander Legends, but this set does add a lot of cool support for the mechanic. For example, each color gets a new Court card. These are enchantments that make you the Monarch when they enter the battlefield, and they all give you some static recurring benefit each upkeep, and that benefit is amplified if you're the Monarch. These court enchantments really add significant benefits to being the Monarch in addition to drawing an extra card at the end of your turn. In fact, they are so cool that if we're going to focus on the Monarch mechanic in our deck, we really need to talk about each one of these. So let's get to it. Court of Ambition is the black court. It costs 2 and 2 black. It makes you the Monarch when it enters the battlefield, and again, for reference, all the courts do this. Court of Ambition also has, at the beginning of your upkeep, each opponent loses 3 life unless they discard a card, but if you're the Monarch, instead each opponent loses 6 life unless they discard 2 cards. The green one is Court of Bounty. This one costs 2 and 2 green, and at the beginning of your upkeep, it lets you put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. But if you're the Monarch, you can put a land or a creature from your hand onto the battlefield. Court of Cunning is the blue one. This costs 1 and 2 blue, and at the beginning of your upkeep, any number of target players each mills 2 cards. But if you're the Monarch, they mill 10 cards instead. Now this is cool because you can use it in a mill deck where you're trying to mill your opponents out, or you can just use it to mill yourself if you can take advantage of the stuff in your graveyard. Court of Grace is the white version. This costs 2 and 2 white. It creates a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying at the beginning of your upkeep. But if you're the Monarch, you get a 4/4 angel token with flying instead. And then Court of Ire costs 3 and 2 red, and it has, at the beginning of your upkeep, you get to do 2 damage to any target. But if you're the Monarch, you get to do 7 damage instead, again to any target. So that's pretty cool. There's also several new creatures in Commander Legends that grant Monarch. We won't go over all of them here, but some of the notable ones are, for example, Archon of Coronation. This is a 5/5 flyer for 4 and 2 white. When it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch, and as long as you're the Monarch, damage doesn't cause you to lose life. So the wording on this card is weird. It doesn't actually prevent damage that would be dealt to you, it just causes the damage to not make you lose life. Now, I get it, this sounds like the same thing, but in any case, because of the way it's worded, having Archon of Coronation out does not actually prevent someone from taking the Monarch status from you by hitting you with a creature. Now, I think I'm correct in how that works, but please let me know if anyone knows that I'm incorrect here. Azure Fleet Admiral is a 3/3 human pirate that costs 3 and a blue. When it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch, and it can't be blocked by creatures the Monarch controls. So it can always take the Monarch status back from someone else if you lose it. Dawnglade Regent is an 8/8 elk. Oh, wow, that's a big elk. Do elk get that big? Elk should not get that big. Anyways, this big boy costs 5 and 2 green. When it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch, and as long as you're the Monarch, permanents you control have hexproof. Emberwild Captain is a 4/2 Djinn pirate that costs 3 and a red. When it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch, and if an opponent attacks you while you're the Monarch, Emberwild Captain deals damage to that player equal to the number of cards in their hand. So it taxes an opponent's life total if they want to steal the Monarch from you. And black didn't get a new Monarch creature within this set for some reason. So there's some really cool new Monarch cards in Commander Legends, but even with these new cards, we need to realize that Monarch alone is typically not a win condition, so any deck built around the mechanic will still need some other ways to win. So I think it's time to decide who gets to command this deck. First, let's talk about Teysa, Envoy of Ghosts. This is a 4/4 human advisor that costs 5, a white and a black. It has vigilance and protection from creatures. And it also has, when a creature deals combat damage to you, destroy that creature and create a 1/1 white and black spirit creature token with flying. Now, let's be fair, Teysa is a bad commander. It's 7 mana for a 4/4 that does nothing right away. I mean, this is almost as bad as Konda, Lord of Eiganjo. But Teysa fits really well with Monarch. Protection from creatures means unblockable, so we can take Monarch from an opponent easily. Also, if an opponent takes Monarch from you, Teysa destroys that creature after combat damage is dealt, so your opponents are going to be less likely to even try to take the Monarch from you. And because Teysa has vigilance, it can always block, and because it's protected from creatures, it means it won't die in combat. So Teysa was really built for Monarch. Sorry, Marchesa. But again, Monarch isn't enough to build around, so what else should this deck do? Well, we can use blink effects to help us keep the Monarch status, and we can also use it to win. Gary drains each opponent for life equal to our devotion to black when it enters the battlefield, and we gain that much life. Blink it a few times and you'll usually win the game. And white, again, is good at blink. See Cloud Shift, Eldrazi Displacer, and Eerie Interlude, for example, but there's plenty of other cards. And again, because we're running blink, it helps us get the Monarch back if we lose it. I mean, if Teysa's not on the battlefield or you can't get in for combat damage, you can just blink your Thorn of the Black Rose to steal the Monarch mechanic back. And these blink strategies can enable win conditions and value through the repeated ETB triggers, while Monarch is just here to provide support. But if you don't like Teysa because she's bad, well, what about Jared Carthalion? Jared is a new creature, a new legendary creature in Commander Legends. It's a 3/3 human warrior that costs red, green, white. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent becomes the Monarch, and you can't become the Monarch this turn. And if damage would be dealt to Jared Carthalion while you're the Monarch, prevent that damage and put that many +1/+1 counters on it. So now you have access to the Monarch in your command zone, but since you're giving it to an opponent, you'll need to jump through some hoops to get it back from them. Also, since we're in white, we can use the same blink strategies with Monarch again to regain the Monarch status. Not with Jared, of course, but with any other creature that gives us Monarch when it enters. And there's some silly things you can do with Jared's immunity to damage while you're the Monarch, but I'd really rather focus on the blink strategies. Though there are certain powerful strategies that focus on Jared's immunity that you'll probably still want to include in this deck, like Pariah. Now, this deck concept won't be too different than Teysa. You find the best creatures to blink in the colors that you have and the best blink effects. This time we're just playing Naya instead of Orzhov. But honestly, I don't think Jared's ability when you're the Monarch is all that great. We can probably do better if we're building around Monarch. So Queen Marchesa has been sitting there patiently in the corner and plotting my death, so I think it's time to talk about the OG Monarch commander. Queen Marchesa is a 3/3 human assassin that costs 1 red, white, black. It has Death Touch and Haste, and when it enters the battlefield, you become the Monarch. It also has, at the beginning of your upkeep, if an opponent is the Monarch, you create a 1/1 black assassin creature token with Death Touch and Haste. So Queen Marchesa gives us access to the Monarch in our command zone, and those assassin tokens can help us get the Monarch stats back if we lose it. Now, in this deck, I still think we should be focusing around the blink strategy to help ensure we can keep the Monarch status, and of course to get repeated ETB triggers from our other creatures to help us win the game. Now, the cool thing here about having Monarch in the command zone is that we don't need as many Monarch enablers, and it also means we'll be able to get the Monarch status into the game much more reliably. For example, if you were playing with Teysa as your commander, you'll note that Orzhov only has 8 creatures that grants Monarch, plus 3 enchantments and a land, but only the creatures can be blinked. So some games you might have trouble finding a Monarch card. If you're playing Jared, then Naya has 13 creatures and 4 non-creature permanents that grant Monarch. And using Queen Marchesa eliminates the need for most of these, which saves a lot of deck spots for more blink effects or, whatever else you need. And the addition of red here permits additional chaos or combat effects that help us keep the Monarch status, like Goad. But let's get away from blink for a moment. There are probably better ways to take advantage of Monarch. Let's talk about Marisi, Breaker of the Coil. Marisi is a 5/4 cat warrior that costs 1 green, red, white. It has your opponents can't cast spells during combat. Take that, blue. And it also has, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, goad all creatures that player controls. Now, if you're not familiar with goad, a goaded creature must attack during its controller's next combat, and it must attack a player other than you if able. Now, I think Marisi is probably the best option here because it can use Monarch as a support towards its primary win condition plan, which is generally unobstructed combat damage because of goad, and of course supplemented by your opponents dealing combat damage to each other, also again because of goad. Now, Marisi can protect your Monarch status because opponents can't attack you to take it from you if you goaded them. Now, Marisi already values getting creatures in for combat damage, so taking Monarch back if you lose it should be pretty easy. I'm not going to go over too much in this video about how we want to build Marisi because the deck design really wouldn't vary too much from the norm. Marisi uses cheap, evasive creatures to goad its opponents. Think about things like Ginger Brute, shadow creatures like Soltari Champion, and then you can supplement with additional goad or forced attack effects like Bloodthirsty Blade or Fumiko the Lowblood, but these are standard cards you'll see in a Marisi deck. So in this build, we're really just supplementing with the Monarch mechanic to help us out with card draw, and maybe get some additional value from those court enchantments. Now, if you don't like Marisi, you can also consider Thantis the Warweaver. Thantis is a 5/5 spider that costs 3 black, red, green. It has Vigilance and Reach, and it says all creatures must attack each combat if able, and whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, you put a +1/+1 counter on Thantis the Warweaver. Now, just like Marisi, Thantis wants forced combat to help pick off your opponent's weak utility creatures and pressure everyone's life totals. But unlike Marisi, Thantis doesn't goad, so your opponents can choose to attack you. That said, Thantis will get big quickly and will eat most attackers, so that will hopefully discourage most of them from attacking you. And just like with Marisi again, we're not changing the normal deck design for Thantis too much, so I'm not going to go over specific recommendations here. We're really just adding support with the Monarch mechanic. I guess if you prefer Naya, you could go with Marisi, and if you prefer Jund, you can use Thantis. Now, I really like the goad mechanic myself, so I'd lean towards Marisi, but I think either commander works fine here. And lastly, we are going to talk about Nostro, Voice of the Crags. Nostro is a 3/3 Chimera that costs 1 red, white, blue. It can tap unless you choose one, where X is the number of spells you've cast this turn. You can scry X, or you can have Nostro deal X damage to target creature, or you can gain X life. Now, Nostro hasn't received much attention yet, and I think everyone's sleeping on this guy. I mean, he's an obvious Storm commander or combo commander, but again, that's obvious, so let's do something less obvious. Let's do Life Gain Matters. So why do we want to focus on Life Gain? Well, let's consider each of Nostro's 3 abilities. The Scry ability is primarily, I think, going to be for digging for combo enablers. There are a few other things you can do, like use miracle cards or other top deck manipulation, but I don't think this is that strong. Now, using the Scry ability is probably pretty effective in those combo decks. Again, this just turns Nostro into an enabler for whatever unrelated combo you like. Maybe this is more of a CEDH strategy. Nostro's second ability, dealing damage to creatures, is useful and you'll use it, but it's generally not a win condition. So, by a simple process of elimination, we're left with the Life Gain ability. And again, of course, you can use any of these abilities during a game. Regardless of how you build Nostro, you probably want to prioritize one of them. So in this case, playing a Life Gain deck in Jeskai colors is unusual. Often we'd be in colors that include both white and black. So what kind of Life Gain payoffs are there in Jeskai? And why do we want to play Life Gain in these colors? So I think one of the biggest things we want to look at in Jeskai Life Gain is Group Slug. We're going to burn everyone, including ourselves, and then use the Life Gain to offset the self-damage. Mana Barbs is a Group Slug staple. It's an enchantment that costs 3 and a red. It says whenever a player taps a land for mana, Mana Barb deals 1 damage to that player. Heartless Hidetsugu, we all know this guy. It's a 4/3 Ogre Shaman that costs 3 and 2 red. It can tap to deal damage to each player equal to half that player's life total, rounded down. There's Pyrohemia. This is another red enchantment, and most of your Group Slug cards are going to be red in this deck. It costs 2 and 2 red. It lets you pay a red to deal 1 damage to each creature and each player. But at the end of any turn, you sacrifice Pyrohemia if there aren't any creatures on the battlefield. But there are plenty of other red effects that burn the whole table, so again, you can pick the ones that you like. Now, we probably want to focus heavily on these Group Slug type effects, since there are much better Life Gain commanders out there than Nostro, and really Nostro's only distinguishing quality is that he lets you play red. So, to make him stand out, we should really lean into what red gives us access to, and I think that, for us, is going to be Group Slug. Now, for comparison, the only other commander that really focuses on Life Gain as a strategy, and includes red, is Lycia, Lycia. We'll go with Lycia. Lycia, Sanguine Tribune. Lycia is a 4/4 vampire soldier that costs 5 red, white, black, but it costs 1 less for each life you've gained this turn. It has first strike and lifelink, and you can pay 5 life to put 3 +1/+1 counters on it, but you can only do this during your turn and only once per turn. Lycia is probably a much better life gain commander than Nostro. First, it has black, which is great in life gain decks, since black has a lot of cards that let you pay life for some benefit. And Lycia is also pretty good at helping you gain life, though to do so she is dependent on the combat step. So what can Nostro do better? Well, because we have access to blue instead of black, we should have ready access to card draw, control, and storm mechanics that Nostro values. I should also point out that we might consider an unusual suite of group slug cards. Rather than using lots of permanents that burn everyone repeatedly, we might consider augmenting Nostro's spellcast count with cheap group slug spells. Flame Rift, for example, is a simple sorcery that costs 2 mana and deals 4 damage to each player. Mind Bomb is similar, and I'm pretty sure no one plays this ever. It costs 1 blue mana and deals 3 damage to each player, but players can discard a card for each damage they wish to prevent this way. Usually they'll just take the damage. Gibbering Fiend is a permanent. It's a creature, but it's cheap, so we can cast multiple spells more readily when we use this. It's a 2/1 devil that costs 1 and a red, and when it enters the battlefield it deals 1 damage to each opponent. But it also deals 1 damage to each opponent at the beginning of that player's upkeep if they have 4 or more card types among cards in their graveyard. Acidic Soil is a sorcery for 2 and a red that deals damage to each player equal to the number of lands they control. Broiling Vortex is a pretty awesome utility enchantment. It costs 1 and a red, and it deals 1 damage to each player at the beginning of their upkeep, but it also deals 5 damage to a player that casts a spell without paying mana for that spell. And you can also pay a red to prevent your opponents from gaining life until the end of the turn. Again, there's lots of options for burning the table. You'll probably want to prioritize spells that have low mana costs or replace themselves so that you can cast several spells per turn. Now, we'll need to rely on blue effects to keep our hands filled if we're going to be doing all the spell casting. I'd recommend cheap card draw spells, cantrips, cards with flashback and jumpstart. For example, Ponder, Think Twice, Radical Idea. In this case, we probably care more about quantity of spells than quality, so drawing a single card for a low mana cost might be better than drawing many cards for a higher mana cost. But what really supercharges this deck, and probably in fact any Nostro deck, is effects that untap Nostro. And that means we can tap him multiple times per turn. Fortunately, blue also has a lot of these effects. Cerulean Wisps is a single blue mana for an instant that draws us a card and untaps a creature. Of course, it also increases your storm count to power up Nostro. Jeskai Ascendancy is also dumb here. This is an enchantment that says whenever you cast a non-creature spell, creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn, and untap those creatures. You may also draw and discard a card. So this means whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you get to untap Nostro and grow his storm count. We'll also run classics like Freed from the Real and Pemin's Aura. These are auras that let you untap the enchanted creature as many times as you can afford for just a single blue mana each time. As long as we're casting a lot of spells, we might as well play Kaikar. This guy gives us a 1/1 white spirit creature token whenever we cast a non-creature spell, and he also lets us sacrifice a spirit to add red. Kaikar's great in this deck because you cast a spell, you get a guy you can sack for mana, and you can spend that mana to cast more spells and get more guys. And Whirlwind of Thought follows in the trend of broken Jeskai enchantments. It lets you draw a card whenever you cast a non-creature spell. Now, since we're prioritizing life gain with Nostro, we can include life gain payoffs too. Dawn of Hope is an enchantment that lets you pay 2 whenever you gain life in order to draw a card. You can also pay 3 and a white to create a 1/1 white soldier creature token with lifelink. Alhamaret's Archive is an artifact that says if you would gain life, you gain twice that much life instead. And also, if you would draw a card, except the first one you draw in each of your draw steps, you draw 2 cards instead. And in this deck, we are going to be doing a lot of both of those, auto-include. Searing Meditation is an enchantment that lets you pay 2 whenever you gain life to do 2 damage to any target. This is a bit expensive, but it will give you some added reach. Crested Sunmare. This is a 5/5 horse that lets us create a 5/5 horse creature token at the end of any turn in which we gained life. And finally, even though we're focusing on the life gain function of Nastro, we shouldn't ignore other powerful synergies. Brash Taunter, for example, is a 1/1 indestructible goblin that costs 4 and a red. It has whenever Brash Taunter is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to target opponent. You can also pay 2 and a red and tap it to have it fight another target creature. So Brash Taunter basically lets us tap Nastro to deal damage to a player instead of a creature. Aetherflux Reservoir is an artifact that lets us gain life equal to the number of spells we've cast this turn whenever we cast a spell. But most importantly, it also lets us pay 50 life to deal 50 damage to any target. Illusionist's Bracers is an equipment that lets you copy Nastro's activated ability whenever you activate it. And Isochron Scepter lets us imprint any key instant spell with CMC 2 or less to cast it repeatedly. Maybe we want Cerulean Wisps to untap Nastro and draw an extra card each turn, or Price of Progress to deal damage to each player equal to twice the number of non-basic lands they control. Again, do that each turn. So I think Nastro is in fact inherently fairly powerful, even though the activated abilities don't necessarily look all that great. But alright, that is all I've got for now. Commander Legends is a pretty big release for our format, so I'm sure there will be plenty of new interactions and deck builds based on this set that the community will continue to discover for months and months. Anyways, please like this video or subscribe if you have found any of this useful. I'll be posting weekly videos describing all sorts of unconventional ways that you can build your commander decks, from budget alternatives to deck techs to top 10 lists. And thank you for watching.